What's up guys, the Strong Boys 19 here. This is going to be another installment into the re-ranking from one of my most favourite bands of all time. That is of course with the infamous albums of Pink Floyd. Now this original ranking that I had done a few years back wouldn't be really different into this re-ranking, but I think with the positioned placements of these albums, I find that this is, to me, maybe my own personal and best takes on where I would rank these albums, with a lot of the different reasons behind where I place them. But with that being said, if you want to share a list of your own, please put it in the comments section down below, and you can also let me know what you think of this particular list. Number 15, my least favourite Pink Floyd album, is the band's final studio album, The Endless River. The Endless River was released after 20 years to celebrate the anniversary of what I would still see as the band's actual final album before this, but the final product into finalising once again Pink Floyd's discography, a mostly enjoyable replay at first, but the more I've been thinking about it, and to summarise the better conclusion, the album for me is one of the biggest and weakest disappointing albums to finalise a discography from a major band. I do understand and give credit to the sentimental approach that this is more or less like a tribute to Richard Wright. However, in terms of the execution side of it, while the album is at some points an enjoyable direction, in terms of the whole thing though, the album did drastically feel as a bland and a poor way to completely fulfill the hurrah moment into the band's discography. Besides, the production is still really nice, and hearing some more of the ambient textures on the keyboards, and of course with the only lead vocal track that is the final song on this album, Louder Than Words. The biggest criticism that I can give about the album was the whole experience was not as a whole satisfying product. The compositions do come off as, at some points, as lazy and as not as memorable. Most of the time, some of these compositions last in less than 2 minutes, and it feels like a rehash. As much as a respectable choice why Gilmour and Mason wanted to make this album, this is unfortunately not one of the best of ideas. I still remember highly that this was, I think at the time, the most pre-ordered album of all time on Amazon, which is just as mad. It makes me think as well that King Crimson's final album, The Power to Believe, had a lot of the brilliant depth and power than what this album did go through its surface. Number 14 is Omagoma. This album was originally ranked higher from my previous listing. Omagoma for me is not a bad Floyd album, and I do understand that some people see it as maybe the worst Pink Floyd record besides the now aforementioned The Endless River. I think this is where the band were focusing something too different and moves away from what they were really trying to make in terms from the aftermath of Syd Barrett's departure. The studio version of this is more or less this really instrumental, packed, driven, music concrete, avant-garde exploration. And to make things difficult, this is a very confrontational and jarring album for a lot of people. Besides that, there are some vocals here and there from tracks like Grantchester Meadows to The Narrow Way, which are really strong tracks, and I do enjoy the Sisyphus compositions from Wright and the Grand Vizier's Garden Party from Mason, but the Several Species composition from Waters is for me the worst composition of complete muzak in Pink Floyd's discography. The live album part was really, really good, recorded at the legendary venue at the time that was the Mother's venue in Birmingham, but I can see the argument when some Floyd fans would be dismissive and be totally against what the album was to begin with. And as I'm a big fan of psychedelics and with the experimentalism, for me, I actually still do highly enjoy what most of this album had turned to be for what its overall musical worth is. Number 13 is More, the first Pink Floyd soundtrack for the film of the same name. For what I can really see, that some fans would be gravitating this album just maybe a bit more over time than Omagoma. The album focuses into a lot of the gentleness and the softer music pieces on some folky, psychedelic pieces. Tracks like with the Nile song can really hit you into its distorting, rocking aggression, and some people say that's maybe an early contender for heavy metal, which is up for debate, obviously. But I really enjoy this album quite a lot as well. You got the tracks of Cymbeline to A Spanish Piece, The Crying Song. It's a really solid album for what was a band at the time that was trying to find some more adventurous paths in their musical DNA. Number 12 is A Saucer Full of Secrets. For me, in my opinion, this is an above average Pink Floyd album. This is as psychedelic and as trippy to follow up the debut album, which is the beloved Piper at the Gates of Dawn, the fully led Syd Barrett album. Although you can briefly hear Barrett on some of these appearances, he did some slide guitar on a few tracks, and you could only hear him doing lead vocals on Jug Band Blues, and as well as with the title track, the instrumental Music Concrete monster that is A Saucer Full of Secrets, although not as a phenomenal one like the track of Interstellar Overdrive. I think some of the other tracks are really, really good. Corporal Clegg to Seesaw, though, for me, are the weaker moments, and I also find the production can get really questionable. This is obviously when Gilmour had first joined Pink Floyd, and he was finding his own ways and spin to add his own beginning chops with his own ability vocally and as well as for guitar that would later on become his signature sound for Pink Floyd's music. A Saucer Full of Secrets, for it being a second album, is really, really solid, but in terms of the favoritism, this one doesn't really, go right up into a lot of these other Floyd albums that most fans would rank it higher more than me in this ranking. But nonetheless, this is still as a dedicated and as a passionate, fulfilling album. Number 11 is A Momentary Lapse of Reason. This is an album that, for me personally, was a lot better over time when I listened back to the 2019 remix. As much as I think that A Momentary Lapse of Reason is not all that bad or weak of an album, there are still some very underappreciated tracks, like the ballad of On the Turning Away. Yet Another Movie is an awesome track, and the final piece of music to this album, which is the concluding song Sorrow, which is a perfect closing track. Signs of Life is a futuristic, different sounding opening song. Obviously we get the single of Learning to Fly, and of course with One Slip, which I do think as well does bringing a lot of this stomping catchy beat. Heavily a collaborative effort that some Floyd fans don't see it as a Pink Floyd record. The first album post the departure of Roger Waters. But you cannot deny the fact that Gilmour was leading his own way, that later on over time, many Floyd fans would see it as a great direction after the sound, with finale Moments of Waters vocally, and for being in Pink Floyd from the final cut. A Momentary Lapse of Reason originally would have been ranked lower in terms of the production from the different mix, but with the remix here, I think that this was a really, really good and a better approachable direction when I listened to this album. Number 10 is Obscured by Clouds. This is the second and final album as a part of a soundtrack. This is a soundtrack for the film of the early 70s film called La Vallée, a French film. Nick Mason said that this is not really a Pink Floyd album. The more I listened to this record, it was a bigger admiration because I think there's a lot of the control and focus into the stronger playing style and the memorable compositions like Childhood's End to Burning Bridges, and even Mudmen, which is mainly the instrumental version of Burning Bridges, to What's the Deal, the title track. It is another really underrated gem of a record, and obviously this is one album that would be out before the worldwide domination that is the next album, The Dark Side of the Moon. Obscured by Clouds has been one of my underrated favourite Pink Floyd albums because while the band had found their sound through the Medal record, this is a record with a lot of the promise and combined result into the musicianship and the rawer and not as polished presence is one of the other best things why I really do enjoy a lot of this album. Number 9 is The Final Cut. This was originally my least favourite Pink Floyd album, and understandably so that some Floyd fans would be heavily dividing their own views and opinions, and yet others would see it as one of the best and favourites, and some would be really ballsy to say that this is a masterpiece. The Final Cut for me took a lot of the time to accept and later on to admire a lot of what this album was meant to be. I know there are criticisms that say that these are like leftovers from The Wall, but to think that argument is, for me, invalid. Most of the material on this album was focused less from following The Wall, because this is basically an anti-war concept with a lot of the imagery dealing into the aftermath from the minds of soldiers, from the fighting in the war in World War II, suffering from PTSD to anxiety and depression, from tracks like Paranoid Eyes to Your Possible Pasts, and one of the most moving, powerful executions for vocal expression and emotions, The Gunner's Dream. Roger's vocals on this album are at one of the absolute best moments. Lyrics on the Falklands War and the other references into some sudden nuclear apocalypse on Two Suns in Sunset, the depression state of feelings in The Final Cut, the title track. I find The Final Cut has been the biggest grower, and come to think about it, this was my most played Pink Floyd album for me before I decided to re-rank this discography. The production is stellar, a beautiful mix, and for me, in my eyes, this is a Pink Floyd record. Besides that, Gilmour and Mason were not present throughout the entirety of the album's development. Waters decides to bring in some session musicians to build the album further and further. The Final Cut, to me, is maybe the ultimate misunderstood album from a big progressive rock band. Number 8 is The Wall. This is a concept album that I do like, but not love a lot of it. One big album that escalated Pink Floyd's popularity through the roof, hailed later on as a classic and as one of the greatest double albums of all time, but I wholeheartedly disagree. It's a strong album. The concept later on can be not as strong as the first half, because the first half is where the darkness, the isolation, and the desperations were building this whole concept into the better path. The first half, for me, was brilliant. It was perfect, especially into the tracks from In the Flesh to The Thin Ice, and the beginning sounds through the haunting soundscapes and the eeriness, dark disparity later on into the record. The second half features stunning guitar work from Run Like Hell to Comfortably Numb, and this whole idea of a record was a great experiment. Obviously, this album was in the making through Waters' mind from the difficult turmoil mentally and physically that he was going through during the Animals tour, and he gave birth to this monster of a double concept album. I know this album is not ranked in my top 5, and I defend my opinion as well that this is one of the other overrated albums of all time and not one of the classics. However, The Wall still is as stupendous and as a cinematic experience as it phenomenally does achieve just as amazingly. Number 7 is Atom Heart Mother. This is an album that I was really divided on at first when I was getting into the band. However, when it goes into the admiration through the different styles, into the chanting choirs, to the music concrete pieces, to the bluesy jams, and the whole giant soundscape of the title track, I have been growing to love this album a lot better. The second half with If to Summer 68 and the incredible Fat Old Son, they're terrific numbers and they perfectly summarize the whole landscape and the journey into what the album and the band had been going into. Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast, to me, is the weakest cut, but it still provides a really interesting aspect into some more vision painting and imageries. Wonderful produced sounds as well, and you can't go wrong with this album for me being a bigger and better improvement after the record previously that was the Omagoma record. It's a very different but amazingly clever record. I do admire a lot into the presentation, into Atom Heart Mother's own musical identity. Number 6 is The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Near perfect, classic, psychedelic, rock-driven record, full into the humour, the wit, and the childish flavour, into the poetic imagery, into the creativity as well through the mind of Syd Barrett. Syd's vocals were wonderful and they do blend in the melodies and as well as later points increase some intensity, like with the track of Bike, which is my personal favourite on here. And Astronomy Domain is another essential, monstrous opening track to open a Pink Floyd record. Lucifer Sam to The Gnome, and of course with the mentioned earlier monster instrumental of Interstellar Overdrive. It is a fun and catchy, memorable, stunning achievement. This album came out at the right time as well, just like with Cream's Disraeli Gears to the other obvious gems of Pet Sounds to Sgt. Pepper's. But there's no denying for the fact that Piper at the Gate of Dawn is another one of these other must-own and essential, pleasurable moments in the psychedelic rock period. Number 5 is The Division Bell. Absolute nostalgia. Again, like with Piper at the Gate of Dawn, it's near perfection, with the amazing exceptions through these outstanding tracks of Poles Apart, Wearing the Inside Out, and the big single of the finale track, High Hopes. The concept into the whole communication can be really simple, but the way Gilmour and company decides to craft something like this has been absolute bliss. Overproduced with the extreme usage of reverb, but it never stood away from my favoritism that I love a lot about this record. The bluesy, soulful tracks on What You Want From Me, to some of the poppy essence on Coming Back to Life and Take It Back, to hearing some more of the Ascensions, the beautiful, meditative sound into the instrumental of Marooned, would have just only stayed in as the final album in Pink Floyd's discography. That's another reason why I think The Endless River had aged awfully. But with that being said, I do have so much of the acclaimed and very approached to what I love a lot into this whole album. Number 4 is The Dark Side of the Moon. I know this album had been highly praised as like the number 1 album in most rankings, with my own view to see it as the most overrated and overhyped album ever does not shy away my admiration for it being another one of the classics and, to me, one of the greatest records of all time. What has to be said about The Dark Side of the Moon has been very much talked about to millions of pieces, heavily documented, and everyone and anyone knows about The Dark Side of the Moon. It's not only just an album, but it is a worldwide marketing product. You can buy anything that has the infamous, beautiful prism style artwork on the front, right in front of your eyes. The whole concept into the human condition, to mental health, and some of the politics from the music industry could not have been even more relevant than that. And Us and Them, to me, is the highlight spot on this album, besides the other tracks, like with the whole mournful and emotional The Great Gig in the Sky, to the whole moody and visceral meanings into a lot of the lyrics through the passage of time, and the whole state into this whole album could not have been just as another standout moment into getting a lot of the beloved acclaim that Pink Floyd will later on achieve. Number 3 is Animals. An Animals concept record secretly based on different people, from society to the politicians to the government, targeted as separate animals, to me is a sneaky but brilliant idea. This is when Pink Floyd were at their absolute angriest to date. I actually did also listen to the 2018 remix. I really do love the listening experience from that version, but in my defense, the original production defines the album in this darker, bittersweet and vulgar presence that was stronger. Dogs, which is one of the other monstrous, catastrophic, and terrifically heavy pieces of music, still remains as one of the greatest songs from Pink Floyd of all time. And some of the guitar work from Gilmour are at some of his absolute best yet. Same goes through the vocal department from Gilmour, and as well as Waters. Unsettling sound into the keyboard playing from Richard Wright was terrific, and the awesome drumming from Mason. This is one huge big fuck you, basically. One of the other amazing examples why the musicianship value is super important, and this album does get to be proved as one of these best examples. Number 2 is Medal. In my eyes and ears, this is where Pink Floyd have found their sound, as I've mentioned from my original ranking, but the more I listened to Medal through the constant rotation from beginning to end, from One of These Days to A Pillow of Winds, Seamus to the magnum opus of all long epics in Pink Floyd, that is Echoes. Medal for me is as a wondrous and sublime achieved album. I do adore this record just as immensely. The acoustic guitar playing was gorgeous, softer vocals, and into the harmonies from the connected and attached beauty from Echoes to the other greater different production techniques. Seamus, which is just as perfect, and I also enjoyed Saint-Tropez just as well. Climax and this whole rich, wider sound from the exploration and progression for the band as a whole. Number 1 is Wish You Were Here. This is the ultimate Pink Floyd album, in my opinion, that this is the definition as one of just the greatest, ultimate pieces of music. This is always one of my top 5 albums of all time. The album that has won me over to fall in love with Pink Floyd from beginning to end. This is a concept album with the giant theme of absence and loss through this emotional and mournful state of affairs, heavily dedicated to Syd Barrett, from the wondrous sounds of Shine On You Crazy Diamond, from the first track to the 5th track, and as well through another attack in the music industry into Welcome to the Machine, and of course with Roy Harper's outstanding vocals on Have a Cigar. But with Wish You Were Here, the title track, that is to me one of my top 10 songs of all time. The production is just something to behold. It always puts me in awe, made me completely speechless when I had first heard this album for the very first time. And I do remember after the first listen that I have replayed a lot more of the album over and over on repeat. There's a lot of the sadness, the loneliness, but the best amount of pleasure as a music fan to accept this album for me as the number 1 album in Pink Floyd's discography, and it is the definitive progressive rock album. There you go, guys. That is my list on my ranking once again for Pink Floyd's discography. And as I've said, let me know what you think in the comments down below, and do feel free to share what your Pink Floyd album ranking is, and we shall engage and have some discussion on why these albums were positioned and ranked these ways through your lists. Thank you guys for watching, and as always, I'll keep you guys posted for more videos in the near future.